What's up, nerds? Taiwan is an absolute nightmare to defend. From China's rocket artillery force, to their growing navy and their naval capabilities, to their growing army and their army capabilities, to even just the obstacle of geography. We're going to talk about how all of this kind of makes this whole area a massive strategic dilemma and how it just kind of sucks to try to defend. Now, this is all, of course, a sequel video to a video that I published a few weeks ago talking about why Taiwan is such a difficult place to invade. So these kind of go hand in hand, kind of looking at this conflict from both sides of the coin, really to try to help us gain an understanding on just what kind of obstacles both sides need to navigate with this conflict. So I'll link you to that video if you haven't seen that already at the end of this video. It definitely will help you get more understanding on just why all this really matters. Now, first, I want to take a look at China's rocket force, because this might single-handedly be one of the most important arms of the Chinese military for this conflict, at least in the outset of the conflict. Without having to send a soldier on the beach or a sailor on a ship, China can basically isolate and start targeting military positions all over the island of Taiwan without, again, having to send anyone out to sea. And this could also pose some significant challenges for the U.S. Navy. And that is all done through the whole military branch called the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force. This force was established in the 1960s, and since then it's really only done one thing, and that is grow. It's grown in capabilities, it's grown in size, it's added all kinds of new platforms throughout the years. Until now, it's got a pretty sophisticated and large suite of different missiles, from cruise missiles to ballistic missiles, under its arm. The missiles that the Rocket Force manages are both conventional and nuclear, and they can target anything from ground targets like with cruise missiles and ballistic missiles to ships with its anti-ship ballistic missile suite. And with its large stockpile of missiles that it's built over the years, it's able to isolate the island of Taiwan, basically quarantining it from any kind of outside actor like, let's say, the U.S. Navy, and also start targeting with fairly good accuracy Taiwanese military positions all across the island. Moreover, their longer range missiles can target other U.S. Navy facilities outside of Taiwan, like in Japan, Korea, the Philippines, or even beyond. Now, granted, of course, that's in the case that the U.S. intervenes, which we're going to kind of talk about this scenario a little bit later in this video, but China does have the capability to hit these kinds of targets at a pretty significant range with some pretty significant accuracy. Now, of course, China can hit all of these targets again before a single soldier has entered into port or the beach and a single sailor has hopped onto a ship. Now, of course, realistically, the ground forces will have already been staged on the Chinese side of the strait, at least, and the Navy will already be out at sea. So they will be able to capitalize on these kinds of strikes much quicker. And of course, that takes us to the People's Liberation Army Navy, which is, of course, going to play a very significant role alongside the People's Liberation Army Air Force. Now, whatever the PLARF is not able to isolate on their own, the PLAN, the PLAAF is really going to be able to handle themselves. The PLAN has grown in capacity and capability over the years as well. Really, all of their forces have grown except for the Army. Their Army has shrunk just a little bit, but has grown in capability. But the PLAN has developed 3 aircraft carriers. The one that it bought from Ukraine a long time ago and has spent all this time retrofitting. Another is a copy of that one. And then a third is kind of a mirror image of the Nimitz-class carrier. These carriers would also help the PLAN really kind of isolate and blockade the island of Taiwan from outside interference, while also giving it the ability to also strike Taiwanese targets on the island. For instance, if the PLAN were to station its aircraft carriers to the east, north, and south of the Taiwanese island, then they could facilitate sorties by the PLAAF onto the island or even further out into the Pacific, again threatening U.S. Navy ships trying to come to the aid of Taiwan. Now, while all of this is happening, the PLA would likely be moving troops into port, staging them onto all kinds of civilian ships, from commercial shipping vessels that have been contracted by the government to cruise liners that have been contracted by the Chinese government. And these ships would move from places like Dalian, Fuzhou, Xiamen, and Shantou and began their risky trek across the Strait of Taiwan. Now, of course, we've mentioned in the last video that Taiwan does have its own domestic and foreign-bought anti-ship missile suite. However, with the sheer accuracy and volume of Chinese long-range fires, a lot of these systems may either be hit before they're able to fire or would be otherwise suppressed. And so whatever Taiwan is able to fire, it may not be in the quantity that it needs to have to be able to really threaten the overall passage of the PLA across the Strait of Taiwan. And this, of course, takes us to the landings. Now, you might remember also from the previous video that China's military already vastly outnumbers that of Taiwan's. And of course, we've talked about Taiwan's pretty robust reserve system, which allows its civilians to enter back into the military whenever they're called in, and they can basically just get their equipment and fight. However, at the same time, your limiter at that point is their ability to get to these different military nodes and get their equipment, as well as the amount of equipment that the Taiwanese military has on hand. If we're, say, China starts targeting logistics nodes and Taiwan isn't able to move the military assets across the island that it needs to basically distribute military equipment, like guns, protective equipment like helmets and body armor to their reservists coming in, then that's going to pose a significant challenge to how far, the Taiwanese can really beef up their army ahead of these landings. Simply put, Taiwan might have the bodies on paper, but will they be able to actually use that manpower pool? Now, let's continue to zoom out a little bit here, because at this stage of the whole fight, we're imagining, of course, the PLA is landing on Taiwan. They've managed to suppress a lot of Taiwan's defense systems. But we haven't really talked about the U.S. Navy and really the risk that China has to address of the U.S. coming to Taiwan's aid. We talked a lot about that in the previous video, so let's talk about that here. China would, of course, have to account for that risk, and it appears with the growth of their military that is a risk they're actually long-term planning that they are accounting for. Say the U.S. did decide to intervene. The U.S. Pacific Fleet can accommodate up to 7 aircraft carriers. Mind you that the U.S. has 11 main aircraft carrier battle groups. Now, not all of these are going to be out to sea at the same time. Some of these need to be back home, for maintenance or just back home from deployment. Other aircraft carriers will need to be in other parts of the world dealing with other kinds of crises. However, let's say for this example that somehow the Pacific Fleet is able to get their maximum capacity of 7 aircraft carriers. China, on the other hand, only has 3, so they are outnumbered on aircraft carriers. However, that takes us back to the PLA rocket force. This is an existential threat to the U.S. carrier fleet. Not only will they have to deal with the PLAN, they have to deal with the PLARF. And the PLARF, as far as anti-ship capabilities go, can pin U.S. aircraft carriers hundreds or even thousands of miles away from the island of Taiwan. And that really stretches the range that F-35s and F-18s and other kinds of aircraft that can fly off of aircraft carriers really have. Yes, you can give them fuel pods, you can have air tankers, refuel them in flight. But again, this isn't a non-contested air zone. They're flying into direct combat with the PLAF. So an air tanker is probably out of the question. You don't want external tanks on, say, an F-35 because that negates its stealth capability. And so really they're having to fight over an extremely long range against the Chinese Air Force, where the Chinese aircraft carriers are basically even further to the west of where this engagement area will happen. And this is, of course, preventing the U.S. Navy potentially from getting any kind of supplies and shipping them to Taiwan. They just don't have an open lane. Now, not only can the PLAF launch from aircraft carriers, they're also able to launch from the Chinese mainland. And should China take an airfield or an airport on the island of Taiwan, then they can start using that as well. The PLARF, we've already mentioned, can target U.S. bases in Japan and the Philippines and beyond. So the U.S. can't necessarily even count on those air bases to use for at least very long, since we could really just kind of assume China would rocket those positions to the ground fairly quickly. Yes, those bases have their own defense systems, but again, we're talking about a rocket force whose sole basically plan for decades by now has been to take the island of Taiwan by any means necessary. Now that's what's going on above the surface. Of course, on the surface, China has built up hundreds of ships over the past decades. They've built their navy into nearly one of the largest, if not the largest navy in the world by this point. And really, they're fighting against the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The U.S. Pacific Fleet, whenever we compare who has the most ships, we're comparing the entire U.S. Navy to the entire Chinese Navy. Well, mind you, the entire Chinese Navy does not have to fight the entire U.S. Navy. They only have to fight the U.S. Pacific Fleet. So that is to say, China only has to deal with a localized group of forces, not an entire force altogether. This kind of extends to the subsurface domain, where the U.S., on paper at least, outnumbers China in terms of subs. However, again, consider that a lot of these subs will have to be on other parts of the planet. A lot of them aren't necessarily fit for this kind of warfare, but a lot of them are fit for this kind of fight, and a lot of them would fall under the U.S. Pacific Fleet at this time. So as you can tell by this point, this whole situation gets pretty sticky pretty fast. China has growing capabilities that threaten the U.S. Navy's own capabilities and really force the U.S. to operate at longer and longer ranges. And at this point, we're talking about just fighting to get access to the island of Taiwan, not necessarily, airdropping resources to the island of Taiwan, or even farther than that, landing troops on Taiwan. This all becomes a huge strategic dilemma for the U.S. and Taiwan. We've barely even touched the land warfare component. We've touched the Chinese rocket force, we've talked about the Chinese Air Force and their navies and their capabilities, but now this takes us to the Chinese Army. Because by the time the PLA actually lands on the beaches, we can assume that based on China's other capabilities and the time that may have elapsed by this point, Taiwan's going to be in pretty rough shape, and the U.S. won't really be anywhere nearby to help. While the United States is learning, of course, from the war in Ukraine, so is China. The PLA has published different videos of troops learning with FPV drones and training with drones, and they've also experienced with different kinds of land drones similar to the United States. This is a growing threat that not only impacts, of course, land targets and the Taiwanese army, but they also impact the U.S. Navy. Consider recent videos that have come out of Japan of Chinese tourists flying FPV drones around Japanese and U.S. Navy ships. These videos are a stark reminder that these drones can get pretty much anywhere. They can be used pretty much anywhere, and they can get close to these ships, really as close as the pilot really wants to get. And there are very few capabilities that these ships have to combat those drones right now. As of right now, when I'm recording this video in mid-2024, these capabilities that can combat those kinds of drones are largely still under development or even not even available on the battlefield. You of course have bigger systems like say Sea-Wiz that can handle closer in threats like incoming missiles but at a shorter range, and larger drones and other kinds of aircraft. But FPV drones might be too small for those systems to handle. You have other kinds of systems that are being developed, like using lasers to target these kinds of drones. But again, those are still largely in development, still being tested on the battlefield, and it might take months to years to outfit those systems on ships. Of course, you also have electronic warfare, but that kind of works both ways. It doesn't just jam drones, it might jam your own equipment. The PLA, I say all of this to say that the PLA not only can use these drones on the battlefield against the Taiwanese military, they could use them against the U.S. Navy, against small landing craft that are landing, say, special forces onto the beach, or landing small shipments of equipment and weapons onto the beach to the Taiwanese army. Now that of course takes us to geography. Geography plays a huge factor in this war. We've talked about that a lot in the previous video, how that really helps Taiwan defend itself, but it also makes it very difficult for the US Navy to reach Taiwan and to sustain Taiwan. Mind you, of course in Ukraine, it's easy for Russia to get to Ukraine because you can just walk into Ukraine. And it's also easy to get weapons and support into Ukraine because you can just drive it into Ukraine. But in Taiwan, it's hard for China to invade Taiwan because they have to land troops. It's also hard for the U.S. to get aid to Taiwan because they have to ship it all the way across through a contested area. Also consider the sheer distances involved. Of course, Ukraine has borders with several European Union members. It's obviously in Europe, so it's easy to get a lot of this equipment in. Taiwan is not necessarily close to anybody. It's close to Japan, it's close to the Philippines, and that's about it. And by the time that all of this is going on, Japan and the Philippines may very well also be involved in this conflict. Without them, the next few allies that the U.S. can leverage to help out, like say Australia, they're pretty far away. So distance becomes a factor not only for China with trying to invade Taiwan, but also with the US just trying to reach Taiwan. And that of course takes us to another soft factor that I didn't necessarily talk about in the last video because I didn't necessarily think it was that much of an obstacle, talking about how it's difficult to invade Taiwan, at least on the Chinese side. But I think that it is a factor in this video, and that is the factor of political will. Whether we like it or not, Taiwan is a long ways away from the United States. And whether we like it or not, the war in Ukraine is an example of how a war that was once not politicized is now becoming politicized. We're seeing different groups of people based on political ideology either decide whether they want to or do not want to support, Ukraine in this war. Now, this situation may likely happen in Taiwan as well. And these kinds of sentiments would likely be amplified by Chinese information operations throughout the course of the war. This would probably be worse if this was all happening during an election season, kind of like what we're seeing with Ukraine right now. People in the United States are growing wary of the war in Ukraine after over just 2 years of war. And that is a high-intensity conflict, but a war over Taiwan would be just as, if not more, intense. And it might have even more demand on the U.S. military than the war in Ukraine had. So simply put, we talked in the last video how really China needs to get this invasion done as fast as they can to basically complete it before the U.S. Navy can get to the island of Taiwan. But somewhat paradoxically, the longer the war takes, the more the political will starts to wane in the United States. So there's kind of a golden area early on where China would need to take the island of Taiwan before the U.S. Navy can reach Taiwan. But there's also a time later on in the conflict, if this were to drag on, where they can start counting on political will atrophying in the United States and the will of the United States to remain in the war starting to subside. And obviously this poses some opportunities for them to create more political divisions in the information space. So overall, discussing all of this, we can tell, yes, Taiwan is a nightmare to defend. We've talked about how it's a nightmare to attack as well. So I want to hear your thoughts about this video in the comments. What do you think creates strategic dilemmas in this situation? And what do you think are some solutions here? Also, what do you think about this series? Would you like to see similar series on other areas? Not quite sure where we would do it, but let me know. And with all that, be sure to subscribe to this channel if you found this interesting and like it, especially. That really helps this video and this channel grow. With all that, I'll see you all next time. Later.